To introduce Mike here. So Mike is a researcher at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Uppsala. Hopefully I'm saying that right. He has 13 years of research experience with specific expertise on how management and land use affect peatland carbon and greenhouse gas dynamics. He currently leads LEAFPad, which is an acronym, and I think it's a marvelous acronym. So congrats on getting that. So LEAFPad is a 4-year project investigating emissions and drivers of greenhouse gases and carbon storage in ditches and constructed ponds. And so with that, I'm going to let Mike take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction and for the invite to be here. So right, let's start. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes about methane and artificial water bodies, so ditches and ponds, and why I think they matter, and hopefully at the end of this you might think they matter as well. Right, okay, let's go. So assuming that a lot of people here know about greenhouse gases and some people don't, here's a very basic introduction of why we care about methane. We're looking at the global warming potential of methane versus carbon dioxide. And methane is a much more potent gas. It warms the climate more than CO2 does. It doesn't last as long in the atmosphere, but it is more powerful. Nitrous oxide, which I'm also interested in, is even more powerful again. But to disappoint N2O fans, there's not going to be any N2O in the talk today. So we'll jump from there straight into the global methane budget, which looks a bit of a scary figure. But we're not going to go too much into the sort of ins and outs of this. The things we're interested in first are this red box at the top is the global methane emission in teragrams per year. So the first thing to point out is that we've got two numbers. We've got 737 and we've got 576. So they're both the estimate of the global methane budget. The right one is what we call the top-down emission. So we come along with a satellite or plane, fly over the landscape, and we can figure out the net emission of methane from the landscape. The 737 is the bottom-up view. So that's the sort of stuff I'm going to be talking about today, where we come along, we measure the methane emissions from the surface of the ecosystem, and then we add up all the different ecosystems and we arrive at this number. Now those two numbers, 737 and 576, they should be the same, but they're not. And the top down should be the more accurate. So we can see that this bottom up one, 737, is too high. And it's also interesting to note that the lower bound on that is 594, which is the upper bound on the top down view. So these aren't even close to meeting. And one of the reasons they're probably not close to meeting is because we've got some double counting of methane from different sources. And that leads me on to the next red boxes at the bottom there, wetlands and inland waters. They're both emitting a lot of methane to the atmosphere. But we could be double counting some wetlands as inland waters and vice versa, because these are very fuzzy categories. A large shallow lake could be a wetland to someone else. And a sort of pond filled with vegetation could be a pond to one person, or it could be a wetland to another person. So when it comes to remote sensing these different ecosystems, we could have some double counting. So that's important to consider. And the second thing about global budgets, which is relevant for what I'm going to talk about today, is anthropogenic and natural emissions. So again, we've got a slightly scary table with lots of numbers in that we're not going to care about too much. But this is a table from the global methane budget. And the top set of data is natural sources. So we can see we've got wetlands there, and we've got freshwaters. And the global methane budget paper, it says these freshwaters include lakes, ponds, reservoirs, streams, and rivers. Now we could have a good debate about whether reservoirs should be in there. Maybe if we dam a lake, that's a natural source, but maybe if we build a reservoir from scratch, that's not a natural source. And the second set of columns at the bottom here is the anthropogenic sources, which is where we'll find our constructed ponds, our constructed wetlands, our ditches, and our canals. And my interest in these comes from the fact these anthropogenic sources are what we need to account for in our national greenhouse gas inventories. So we need to know what these things are emitting. So we'll jump straight into ditches. We know that ditches are great for emitting lots of methane. They can have a lot of labile carbon, a lot of nutrients going into them sometimes. They can be in intensively managed landscapes. So we know that they emit methane. And this figure is from a peatland ditch synthesis Chris Evans led a few years ago. And we're simply looking at the annual methane emission on the vertical axis. And we're going from low intensive ecosystems to high intensive ecosystems. So sort of forests through to peat extractions, grasslands, and deforested tropical peatlands. So we see for these peatland ditches, there's more methane with increased land use intensity. And again, a slightly busy table. And what we're interested in here, this is that data into the 2013 IPCC wetland supplement. So this was the first time ditches were accounted for in greenhouse gas inventories. So the red bar here is our ditch emission. And for these peatland ditches, there was enough data out there that the authors could disaggregate the data by climate zone. So, tropical ecosystems are emitting more than the boreal and temperate. And there was enough data that they could disaggregate by land use, which is the slide, the figure I just showed you. But we also need to consider these ditch emissions in the landscape context. So again, we're still talking just about peatland ditches here. And this is a figure that I think would be sort of familiar to most of us, what happens when we drain a peatland. And specifically for methane, we think that you drain your peatland, the terrestrial part of it gets drier, it emits less methane. But circled in red here, we do have some methane coming off the ditches. But we see a net reduction in the landscape scale methane flux. And I think most people would agree with that. Apart from the fact, if we jump to this next slide, and I saw Nigel was here, this is one of his papers from a few decades ago. And Nigel and Tim Moore showed that if you have enough ditches in your drained peatland and they're close enough together and emitting enough methane, that feasibly drainage could lead to a net increase in landscape scale methane emission. Now, I'm not going to argue that that's the normal effect of drainage, but it shows that for a long time we've known we need to consider these ditches in the landscape scale budgets. So from there, I'm going to jump through a few little studies I've been involved in about ditches and landscape scale budgets, talking mainly just about peatlands to begin with. So here we are in the southeast of England, intensively managed farmland for salads and vegetables. So the drainage is so intensive that the water table is deep within the surface of the fields. And because those fields are so dry, they take methane out of the atmosphere. But the ditches are emitting a lot of methane. So if we add up the ditch emissions and the area those ditches occupy, and the field uptake and the area the fields occupy, we actually find out that the ditches win, as it were, and the landscape is a net source of methane, which we wouldn't have realised if we'd ignored those ditches. They're the key to this intensive arable landscape. And then if we jump over to Sweden, here we are about an hour north of Uppsala in a felled forest. And again, the drainage is very intensive. So the terrestrial part of this felled forest is taking methane out of the atmosphere again. But here we have something different going on because the ditches are so dry for a lot of the year that the ditches actually aren't emitting much methane. So here the ditches don't really make much difference to the landscape scale budget. and the landscape as a whole is still a net sink of methane. But there's an interesting little postscript here, in that we had an experiment looking at ditch cleaning. And we see here that the terrestrial part of the site is a methane sink. The uncleaned ditch is emitting a lot of methane, and the cleaned ditches, where the vegetation has been removed, they're hardly emitting any methane at all. And this is probably due to two reasons. Firstly, that the vegetation itself can act to release methane directly from the sediment into the atmosphere. And secondly, that the vegetation can release a lot of labile substrates for methanogens. So there we have a little hint that we can manage these ditches to mitigate their emissions. So our next example site is what I'm calling a re-wetted fen. It's not been re-wetted very successfully, and the water table is quite deep in the peat for a lot of the year. And at this site, we've got the terrestrial surface of the peatland as a mixture of meadow grasses that take up methane from the atmosphere, and these big clumps of juncus that emit methane to the atmosphere. But the net effect across the whole peatland of the juncus and the meadow grasses is that there's zero methane emissions from the terrestrial part of the fen. But again, the ditch is emitting a lot, and so as a whole, the landscape again is a source of methane. And then we can jump across the river to a fen called Wicken Fen, which is the oldest nature reserve in the UK. And this is probably the closest thing we have to a semi-natural fen in the UK, which is laughable to anyone in any other country, really, because it's far from being pristine. But the water table is quite high. It's got ditches in the site, but they don't really do a very good job of draining it, so it's very wet, as a fen should be. So because of that wetness, we find that the fen itself, the terrestrial part of it, emits a lot of methane through the cladium and the phragmites, and the ditch emits a lot of methane. But because the fen itself is emitting, the ditch is less important in the landscape scale flux. And then the final example I'm going to talk about for this part of the talk is about blanket bog, which again is a very UK specific thing, really. So we're about 400 or 500 meters up in the hills here, ombrotrophic systems. And because it's a low nutrient system, the ditch is emitting a little bit of methane, and the bog itself is emitting a little bit of methane. And then we came along and the ditches were blocked. We re-wetted the bog, and we found that the bog got a little bit wetter and emitted a little bit more methane. Not much happened to the ditches, except in some cases we had the ditches colonized by Aereophorum. And visually it was really impressive, because from a kilometre away you could see these white stripes marching across the hillside where the Aereophorum was flowering along these re-wetted ditches. And where the Aereophorum colonized, we found absolutely huge methane fluxes from the ditches, and it totally skewed the landscape scale budget. So that leads me to conclude this part of the talk about re-wetting, and that the IPCC recognizes that in these re-wetted landscapes we might have relic ditch networks. But the IPCC also assumes that these ditches are emitting the same amount of methane as the re-wetted peatland. And in some cases, that's probably a fair assumption. But for some systems, like maybe re-wetted grasslands or polluter-culture, the ditch is probably emitting more. And we don't really have enough data to know how important this is, but it's definitely something for future work. So anyway, following on from all this work and from the peatland ditch synthesis that Chris Evans had led, we added on all the other ditches and canal emissions we could find on all soil types for the 2019 IPCC refinement, which is what we're looking at here. We have this emission factor of 416 kilograms of methane per hectare per year. So that's a global emission factor. We didn't have enough data to disaggregate this by climate zone or land use. So what this emission factor is saying is it's saying that if you have a ditch in northern Sweden, that's emitting the same amount of methane as a ditch in, say, subtropical India. So clearly that's not true, but it's the best we can do at the moment without more data. And we published a synthesis of that IPCC data, which is what these figures are from. And we can see on the left figure that we've got more methane in tropical zones. And on the right figure, we do have more methane in eutrophic systems versus oligotrophic systems. But we've got the raw data points on those figures, and we can see the variation is massive, really. So this isn't a tidy data set. It's not a clean story as we would like to find. And the reason is probably that, we can say that a eutrophic ditch will emit more methane than an oligotrophic ditch. But if that eutrophic ditch dries out for half of the year, it won't be emitting methane, and therefore it will be emitting less than an oligotrophic ditch that's wet for all of the year. So there are various different factors at play to drive these emissions. So we can try and do some upscaling using some really back of the envelope figures. So here we are in Finland, where we know how much forestry we have on drained peatland. We can make some assumptions about the drainage density and the ditch width, and we can take a ditch flux from our synthesis, and we can sort of do very simple multiplication to suggest that in Finland, ditches could be emitting about 0.05 teragrams of methane per year, or 9% of their anthropogenic emissions. And then similarly, we can go to the Netherlands, where we know roughly how many ditches there are, and we can assume how wide they are, and take another ditch flux. And here we end up with 0.07 teragrams of methane per year. And I hope this isn't sort of total cloud cuckoo land guessing, because some other people also did an upscaling for the Netherlands, similarly back of the envelope approach, but they used a narrower ditch width and a higher flux, and they arrived at a slightly higher figure of 0.09 teragrams, but we're in the same ballpark, so that's nice to see. So what about a global upscaling? We did this, and I should preface this by saying that this is wrong, but it's the best wrong we have, really. And we wanted to do a very back of the envelope upscaling to try and draw attention to how important these ditches could be and to get other people interested in them. So here's our global ditch emission calculator. We're going to calculate our global ditch surface area using the global area of drained land and what we call frac ditch, which is simply the proportion of ditches in the landscape as a whole. So we can take our mean annual methane flux from the synthesis, area of drained land. We're assuming that ditches on average occupy 3% of the landscape, of the drained landscape. And we can multiply this all together, and we end up at 3.5 teragrams of methane per year for the global ditch emission, which for context is about 1% of anthropogenic methane. So as I say, this is wrong, but it's a wrong to start things off. And at one point we had a more complicated upscaling using different land uses and climate zones. And in the end, we reverted back to the simplest thing we could do, in the thinking that a simple wrong answer was better than a complicated wrong answer. And then to finish this section on ditches, these ditch emissions, as I said, depend on water being present. So on this left figure, this is all the data from the synthesis. And we see that the ditches that sometimes dry up emit less methane than those that never dry up. And the right figure is from some forest ditches here in Sweden, where we just found 0 methane emissions from dry ditches. So it seems the next step to try and refine these upscalings is to incorporate things like water status and nutrient status into the ditches. So let's suddenly go to ponds. What about ponds? Ponds are totally different, aren't they? Well, maybe they are, or maybe they're not. They're small water bodies that can occupy cumulatively large areas of the landscape. They can have large nutrient loadings and lots of organic sediment, and they can often be in intensively managed land use areas. So I think we can legitimately lump ditches and ponds together. And we know that ponds are important for methane. This is a paper Meredith Holgerson wrote a few years ago, where she showed that smaller ponds emit more methane, and they could be globally important methane emitters. The data behind this was mainly natural ponds and mainly in northern sort of pristine ecosystems. But this nicely started the ball rolling for a lot of pond work that followed. So I'm going to talk through a few upscalings that other people have done to see how important ponds are at the large scale. So here's a paper Al Grinnan wrote from Queensland. So we can see this figure on the right, these 300,000 small water bodies, farm ponds and urban ponds and things like this. And they did some measurements of methane from these water bodies, which included ebullition. So this is quite a robust estimate. And they did some simple upscaling and ended up with a regional flux of 0.05 teragrams. So we're in the same ballpark as the ditch upscalings as well. And then another Australian group in Victoria did an upscaling. Again, they've got over 300,000 of these small farm ponds and things. And again, if they upscale, they end up at 0.02 teragrams. And then we can go to a national upscaling from Selvan Hotel in India here, where they had all these different types of freshwater bodies. And we can see on the figure that ponds are emitting quite a lot. And they did a national upscaling, and we've got about 0.5 teragrams, so quite a lot of methane again. And then finally, the global methane budget did a back of the envelope upscaling for artificial ponds using the mean flux from those Australian papers and a global estimate of farm dams, and they get 3 to 8 teragrams. So same ballpark as the global ditch estimate. So there you go, we know these things are important. Like the ditches, these emissions are dependent on there being water there. Some of these ponds, the water levels can fluctuate, they can dry out. And again, like the ditches, we find if there's no water there, there's no methane. So we took all this pond data, and this went into the IPCC refinement again. And like the ditches, we can't disaggregate by climate zone, and we can't disaggregate by land use. We just got one emission factor for a pond anywhere in the world. If it's constructed, the IPCC says it emits this amount of methane. So since then, I've been spending a lot of time measuring ponds and ditches to try and gather more data to start disaggregating these emission factors, which is what I'm going to walk through now. So this is the first pond study I was involved in with some colleagues at SLU here. And we had a small pot of money to measure 40 urban ponds here in Uppsala just once. It was very rough and ready. But we found some nice things that, there's more methane where there's more phosphorus. Again, not surprising, but nice to see. And then we did something similar, but we measured 16 ditches and ponds through an entire annual cycle across a range of land uses. And we found, again, more methane with more total phosphorus. And again, other people have found the same in the literature, that there's more methane coming from eutrophic water bodies. Here on the left, we've got a figure from one of Jackie Webb's papers from some Canadian farm ponds, where there's more methane with more inorganic nitrate, and the same relationship from one of those Australia pond papers. But then I'm going to take a quick detour from methane into CO2, just because there's something interesting going on here. In that conventional thinking would have us think that more eutrophic systems would actually release less CO2, or even be CO2 sinks, because the primary production goes so high. But what I found in the studies I've been involved in is our urban ponds, and we see more CO2 with more ammonium. Back to our 16 ditches and ponds measured every month, we find more CO2 with more phosphorus. back to Jackie Webb's Canadian farm ponds, there's more CO2 with more nitrate. And back to the Australian farm ponds, we see more CO2 with more nitrate. So what's going on with these small water bodies where eutrophication is actually enhancing the CO2 emissions? And the answer probably lies in this paper by Tonia Del Centro, where they analysed a big data set of lakes and ponds, reservoirs, I think. And they found that, yes, in the large lakes, more phosphorus means less CO2 or a CO2 sink. But in the small water bodies, we find more phosphorus leads to more CO2. And their suggestion is that in these small water bodies, if we've got a lot of phosphorus coming in, it's coming from the catchment, and alongside that phosphorus, there'll be a lot of dissolved carbon dioxide, a lot of DOC, and just a lot of direct inputs to fuel those CO2 emissions. So I think that's really interesting and was slightly unexpected. And something else we found that was quite interesting is that we compared some of our data to natural streams and natural ponds to see how constructed artificial systems compared to natural ones. So for this figure, the green bars are the constructed systems and the blue bars are the natural systems. So here we're comparing our ditches with Emily Stanley's stream methane database, and we see the ditches have more methane in. Then we compare with Meredith Holgerson's pond database, and we see that the large artificial ponds are emitting more than the natural ones, and the same pattern with the medium-sized ponds, and the same pattern with the small ponds. And like in Meredith's paper, we see that as we go from large ponds to small ponds, the emissions get larger. So I don't think this is particularly surprising, because as I've already mentioned, these constructed ponds and ditches will be in intensively managed landscapes where the nutrient loads are just going to be higher. But it shows that we can't use fluxes from natural water bodies as proxies for the fluxes from these constructed ones. And now I'm going to talk about methane evolution briefly. And I've been brave or foolhardy, and we're going to try and watch a short video of some methane bubbles in an impounded ditch. So we have some bubbles there, and then some bubbles over here. So this is ebullition, which is an episodic process where bubbles of methane are released directly from the sediments into the atmosphere. And this can be an important pathway for methane release. Here we're looking at the percentage of ebullition to the total flux. And we see on the left here, in some of these low nutrient peatland systems, ebullition isn't very important. But in some of these other systems, subtropical canals and urban ponds, ebullition is really high, up to 80% of the total flux. So we need to be thinking about this, and we need to be measuring it. And for those who don't do greenhouse gas research, this is a lot of the time how we measure these ditch emissions. It's very high tech meets very low tech. We come along and we put a box on the surface of the water, connect it to an analyzer, and the gases accumulate in that box as they come off the water. So normally we see a nice flux like this, where the methane steadily accumulates in the chamber over time. And that's as the methane just steadily diffuses off the ditch. But sometimes we see noisy things like this, where we have these sudden spikes in methane. And this is where we get these bubbles coming into the chamber. Now, as I said, this is an episodic process. So we can't just stand around measuring with our analyzer, because we might not capture any of it. So we can measure it with bubble traps, which are these sort of glass funnels that we attach into the ditches, and hopefully we catch some bubbles in them, and we come back days or weeks later and we can sample the bubbles. I've used bubble traps in the past, but I'm not a fan of them, because they always seem to go wrong and they often explode when things get icy. So what I'm doing at the moment is using deployments of chambers for 24 hours. When we come along, we put these chambers on the ditch of the pond, leave it there floating for 24 hours and come back the next day. And hopefully we've caught some methane in it that we can analyze. So that's what I've been doing this summer. We had this project LeafPad funded, and the first work package of that is lots of people across the world taking 24-hour chamber measurements. And we can have a look at some of the preliminary data here. So here we're looking at 53 ponds and ditches across the world. For some of these systems, we have 3 replicate chamber measurements, which is when we have 3 different colored bars. Some of them we just have single measurements. But we can see that the methane flux is very variable. We've got some very low fluxes and some very high fluxes. But we can use a method developed by David Bastwicken to use the methane concentration in the water and the methane in our 24-hour chamber to actually put a number on the percentage of the ebullition, which is what this is. This is the same data from those 53 water bodies, but we're looking at how much of the total methane flux comes from ebullition. So we see these handful of sites at the bottom where there's no ebullition going on. But for most of the sites, ebullition is very important, getting up to nearly 100% in some cases. And then nearly finished now. But I had some data from the lab today, so I added these couple of slides. As part of some work with a master's student, I've been looking at this pond on campus. So it's a very small pond. And a few years ago, I measured the annual diffusive emission every month or so. And it was emitting about 44 grams of methane per year, which is quite a lot. It's got a lot of phosphorus in this pond, but not much nitrogen, and a bit of DOC. And we thought it'd be interesting to revisit this pond to try and measure the ebullition. So we've just started monthly deployments of 18 chambers across this small pond to catch the spatial and temporal variation in the ebullition. And here's the data that I just got this morning from the September sampling, excuse me. So on the left, we're looking at the methane emission on one day in one pond from 18 different points. So we see a lot of variation there. And then on the right, we're looking at those same 18 points within the one pond, but the percentage of the total flux that's coming from ebullition. So we see that for most of the sites in the pond, ebullition is the dominant pathway, but we've got these 3 sites in the middle where there's no ebullition occurring, which surprised me, to be honest. So I think the take-home message here is that we need to consider sampling design, we need to consider ebullition, and we need to consider if we're catching that in a representative way. And I've nearly finished now, but to not end on total doom and gloom about these systems being awful for methane, I've not really talked about carbon uptake and carbon burial in these systems, but we know that carbon burial can be high in these small water bodies, and maybe it can offset to some extent the greenhouse gas emissions. So we've just started taking cores from some of these ponds to measure the carbon burial rates. So we'll be able to find out the net carbon balance. And then finally, to note that ponds are great. They may release methane, but this is just a trade-off for the fact that these things are great for sometimes for flood management, but also for biodiversity. If you've got an intensive agricultural landscape, putting a farm pond in there could be one of the best things you could do for biodiversity. And the take-home message is that we just need to manage these systems well and reduce nutrient inputs into them so we can limit these greenhouse gas emissions while enjoying the biodiversity benefits. So ponds are great, despite everything I've said, is the final take-home message. And thank you very much for listening.